Hi everyone. So I'm just going to wait for everyone to join us. My name's Emily and I'm an assistant curator here at Towner Eastbourne. Okay. So I'm really pleased to introduce you to this In Conversation event between the artist Jananne Al-Ani, Michael Rakowitz, and the writer and arts organiser Rijin Sahakian. So just before we begin, I'm going to do a few bits of housekeeping. So Jananne, Michael and Rijin will talk for about 50 minutes, and then there will be a 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A. Please do submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens throughout the talk, and I will then share them with the panel. You can find the automated captioning by Otter AI if you click on the arrow next to the live button in the top left-hand section of the screen and click on View Stream on Otter AI Notes. This is why you will have received a notification that the event is being live streamed. And the event is being BSL interpreted by Samaya C. Tayeb. And it's also being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. And so just a few brief bios before we start. Jananne Al-Ani is an artist, researcher and lecturer working with photography, film and video. Michael Rakowitz is an Iraqi American artist working at the intersection of problem solving and troublemaking. And Rijin Sahakian's work centers Iraq as the site where global power has been deployed, visualized, accelerated for the 21st century, reconfiguring resistance, technology, and visual culture. And so without further ado, over to Jananne.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks very much. And thanks, Michael, for joining us from Chicago and Rijin joining us from Davis, California. It's really lovely to have you both here. I know we could talk for hours and we have done in the past, but I want to try and squeeze into the next 50 minutes some of the issues that concern us all and that we talk about often, and to try and touch on both the new work that I've made for the Towner exhibition, thinking about making exhibitions, thinking about collections, thinking about art education, thinking about art institutions, all of these things I'm hoping we can have a kind of informal to and fro and just share some of our ideas together. But I wanted to start by congratulating Michael on the fact that his work, April is the Cruelest Month, has been acquired by the Towner collection. So I'm very excited because that means Michael's work will be in the collection, as will my new work, Timelines, which is currently on show. And I was really excited when Michael told me about the work, because I had been working for a long time on this tray, which is in the V&A collection, which features British soldiers in Iraq in between 1914 onwards, from the First World War on, and the work that he was making for public show in Margate, which I'm hoping he'll tell us a bit about now, featured a 2003 Iraq war veteran, Dan Taylor, who he had been collaborating with. And Dan Taylor is actually a member of the Veterans for Peace UK, a campaigning organisation, an anti-war organisation. So Michael, your sculpture, which you call an anti-war memorial, was being, there was a ceremony that I attended in November last year on a freezing cold, windy, rainy day. And it was an event that was organised with the Veterans for Peace. And you gave a beautiful speech, and Dan did a speech, but there was a third veteran there who talked with incredible passion and fury about the situation in Iraq and the history of British intervention in Iraq. And so I think maybe because that's the story that's kind of informed this new work of mine. Maybe that's something you could just talk a little bit about in relation to April's the Coolest Month.
Well, thank you, Jananne.
Sorry, yes, and here's, sorry, I should have said, yeah, can we have a couple of images of the work? That would be great for people who didn't get to see it. It was on display for a number of months, wasn't it, Michael?
Yeah, for about 6 months, I believe.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jananne, thank you so much for gathering us here today around this incredible work of yours. And I want to thank Emily and Sarah. Yeah, so April's the Cruelest Month was a site-specific work that I'd done at the invitation of England's Creative Coast, which was asking artists to intervene in public space in different towns and like Margate and Hastings and Folkestone along the coast. And it was interesting for me to go to a place like that because I'd always been a kind of, gem and mineral nerd growing up. And so the idea that I was going to be able to see these white cliffs that I had heard about from relatives that emigrated from Iraq to the UK. One half of the family ended up in the UK. Was really exciting to me, and also knowing that stone held fossils. And what I didn't know was that, being there at this rough edge of this coast where hospitality and hostility kind of coalesce, I didn't know that I was going to see this other statue there that was called the Surfboat Memorial, which commemorates this capsizing of, I think, about 8 or 9 rescue boatsmen that went out at sea in 1897 to try and rescue a boat that was stalled, that was called the Persian Empire, actually. Mm-hmm. And this statue of this man is looking out at sea with his hand to his brow. And I thought about seeing that statue in 2019 when I did the first site visit, and realizing that statue is no longer looking for people to rescue at sea, but based on the policies that Europe has had since the immigration, the forced immigration of people from places like Iraq and Syria, they're looking to turn them away. And so I thought about, the way that coast is part of the battleground. And when I saw this kind of figurative sculpture looking out at sea, I immediately thought about these sculptures that you and Rijin and I know pretty well, which are these 80 larger than life sculptures that Saddam had made for the Basra Corniche after the Iran-Iraq War. And they were of these 80 different officers, and they were larger than life. And it really is kind of like the meaning of the word monument, which comes from the Latin monere, which is about reminding, but it actually means to warn. So they were almost like this warning for the local Shia population. And so when the British occupied Basra after the 2003 invasion, the people took them down. The quotes from a lot of the local Shia population was that they didn't want their kids growing up to hate Iran. And so all of these statues were pointing out towards Iran, where they fell, where these 80 different officers fell. And so I started to think about making a companion for that surfboat memorial. Mm-hmm. And I started to imagine those sculptures that were tossed into the Shatt al-Arab, eventually washing up at sea in Margate, with all the different things that coagulate on it, like the barnacles and the different kind of life forms, like these kinds of pieces of stone that you find on the Corniche of Margate, which are of that chalk, that calcite fossil-bearing stone. And so I thought of that statue emerging not as an Iraqi, but as a British soldier who witnessed those statues coming down. And so that was when I befriended Dan Taylor, and he volunteered to be the model. And so, the way that he described it was that, he changed his position on the war. He went in, and enlisted and it ended up coming out completely different, and having witnessed just what the UK and the US were doing there. And he's become an anti-war activist. And so it's a sculpture that changes its position for a soldier who changed his. And so inside all these different crevices and holes that are in the cast sculpture of Daniel, which is made from the calcite of Margate, but also earth from Basra, there's all these different things that veterans have given as these things that are like votives, that are like these.
That's right. So Michael,
Yeah.
I think because there was a display, there was a series of photographs displaying photographs of the objects that had gone into the sculpture that were on show in the Towner Contemporary. And I wanted to ask you whether some of those related to the First World War, because it looked to me like they did, that some of them were that old, and that I'm imagining would have been handed down from, I don't know, great-grandfather to father to some of these veterans now, or these young men who'd served in 2003, which I just thought was incredible.
Yeah.
So that's correct, is it? Some of those were as old as the First World War.
Absolutely. And I think, it's one of the things that you get from this incredible video that you've made, the timelines video of that tray, is that you understand that there's a vector that connects the not so distant past of World War I and the current continuation of war on Iraq, and seeing World War I as being part of the continuum of the Iraq wars.
I'm just wondering, can we look at the next couple of slides, just for people who haven't maybe seen the exhibition yet, just to give a sense of what we're talking about here, where we have this is the imagery that's on the tray that I've animated and made the film out of, but it features these really stylized English soldiers. Maybe we can move on to the next slide where you see them a bit more clearly. With their smart uniforms and their little hats, and here they are amongst the cannon and the horses, and it's a really, really extraordinary thing, this tray, because its imagery is so complex and dense, and kind of cartoon-like. But yeah, that connection between the events from the First World War, which, it is a continuum. Essentially, the last 120 years in Iraq has been conflict, which begins with British imperial desires to control this territory for its strategic importance in relation to India then at the time, and also for its rich oil reserves. But to go back to the 2003 war, I think we often think about the kind of the catastrophe of that war, and even the 91 Gulf War in relation to Iraq as a modern state, the environment, the population, the infrastructure destruction. But Rijin, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the good things maybe that came out of that post-war period, and ask you to tell us a little bit about Sadat, which translates into English as ECHO, the organization that you established to support young art students in Baghdad in the post-conflict period, which you began, I think you started working in 2011, didn't you? But can you tell us a little bit about Sadat and its history and the work that you were doing there in that early period after the war?
Yeah, I would say that, as you say, there's a long sort of history of different forms of violence in Iraq. But the 2003 war, I guess, or the invasion and occupation, it was probably 2007, 2008 at the point where it was very clear that the occupation had taken a very serious, it was always serious, but it had taken an even more violent turn. And at that point, I think there was 3,000 Iraqis dying a day. And so it sort of became, I think at that point, I was in my early 20s and I was a teenager during the first Gulf War. And I would say that at that point, I had been working in the arts in California. And I think I was sort of done seeing images produced in America and wanted to support artists in Baghdad and sort of look at how a different kind of, you know, I would say part of it was selfish, that I wanted to see their work and sort of see what was being produced there, and to use whatever skills I had to support them. And so I guess I would say some of the research started in 2010. I was in Amman on the Fulbright, but I really applied for that so that I could start taking trips to Iraq and seeing what might be possible there. And it started out as research, sort of going to the Art Institute and the College of Art and seeing if people were interested in this, if this was something that would be useful to them, if there were students that wanted to participate in sort of building a kind of mechanism of, you know, support, breaking some of the isolation that was there. You know, at this point, it was very difficult for Iraqis to leave, as it still is, you know, to sort of travel. And of course, the only people going into Iraq at that point are media and military. And so there was this kind of central focus on Iraq, but in a very sort of one-sided way, with this immense, massive coalition, which is kind of also very important to realize. Like, this is the second time that major nations in the world have come together to fund and exert military sort of violence on the population. And so, you know, the start of that was sort of seeing how there could be some kind of support, some kind of connection of sort of, you know, I would say workshops and programs that would connect them to other artists in other areas, and sort of help support their work as well, sort of development of their own practice, have critiques, all of those things that, you know, every artist relies on everywhere in the world, and sort of looking at how in some small way that could be provided to some of the artists there, especially considering that after the 2003 invasion, the College of Art was severely compromised. You know, the library was bombed. It was really difficult to sort of operate. A lot of professors had been targeted, murdered. And so there was this, you know, this increased flight of people out of Iraq, and also targeted in the country as well. And so this was also part of seeing how some of the resources that every artist depends on could kind of try to be directed in some way towards their work.
But it's kind of important to remember, isn't it, that even post the 91 Gulf War, with the extraordinary sanctions that were in place, that, the art school in Baghdad was still a thriving place, that people, I think it's something people don't really understand or imagine, that life goes on, and life went on, and people still wanted to be artists and went to art school, and they carried on all the way through. So
definitely, even in 2010, during the time, even up to 2015, I'm sure, and now today too, the art school operates, the College of Art operates, people are still making
those problems that you've identified. Yeah, it does continue, because that's one of the things I was really struck by when you started the program, the kind of extraordinary resilience of these art students, who are in their late teens, early 20s, very, very young, who've lived through, who've only known Iraq in a state of war, effectively. They're born in the 90s, or in a state of, extreme tension. Even after the 91 Gulf War, there was a no-fly zone in place. There were still military skirmishes, and these intense sanctions. But I wanted to just read, if you don't mind, an email that you sent to me when you first started working with the students, because I came across it recently, and I was so, well, a couple of things, the fact that you've set up this system for teaching as well, which actually you haven't mentioned, which was to try and teach in this kind of what we now call blended learning in education, because since the pandemic and everybody having to go online, this is a kind of new phenomenon, even us having this conversation like this. But this is what you were doing in Iraq in 2011 with your students. You were working with artists who were outside of Iraq, Arabic-speaking artists, writers, thinkers, who you were beaming in through. I think you were using Skype, or you had some. Did you have some kind of a dedicated setup, or?
Yeah, we had a classroom space that was sort of rented out from the film center, which was a nice area. By the river, it's a nice area, and so students would sort of gather there, and we had a projector in the screen, and they would be sort of beamed in and
live feeds. So kind of revolutionary. But anyway, I just want to read this out because I was just really taken by it. Just yesterday, Jalal Tawfiq gave his workshop to the students, beamed into Baghdad from his place in Berlin. As I'm sure you've heard, Baghdad had a terrible series of bombings with more than 70 people killed. A number of the students knew people who were lost in the attacks, and they were incredibly shaken up. Some people even slept in the film center in central Baghdad where the workshops are held because they couldn't get home. When I spoke to them, I asked if they wanted to cancel the class, and they refused. They wanted to continue with it. So they had the workshop with Jalal the next morning, and it was an incredible class. The students are just learning so much, and having someone outside, I think, is huge at this point. And that feeling of being alone and isolated in the global community is so huge. At any rate, my respect for them is really huge. As Jalal put it, there are students who don't come to lectures in Istanbul or Berlin because it's Saturday or it's nice outside. And then there are these students. So one of the things you've talked about often is this desire to be seen and to be heard, which is the thing that isn't happening for artists in Iraq and didn't happen for many, many years, even before the 91 Gulf War, because of the kind of intensity of the restrictions from the regime. But so I wanted to think about this idea of telling stories and being heard, because that's also part of this new work that I've made, this idea of maybe narratives that are not so familiar or haven't been heard, or voices that haven't been heard. And Michael, I wanted to come back to you because in your work, you've worked so beautifully on a number of your projects with your mother, and you've spoken about your mother's stories from Iraq, because your mum was born in Baghdad, but left when she was young and had very strong memories of Baghdad. And that's for anybody who's living in exile who has children, the children of exiles always have this special relationship with their place where their family have come from. And in the case of Iraq, it's often been very difficult for people to go back. So it isn't, or to go at all. But there were two stories that you tell about your mum that I was really moved by. And one of them was about you coming to London as children and visiting the British Museum and seeing the extraordinary Assyrian friezes from Ashurbanipal's palace in Numrud. And your mum saying to you and your brothers, why are these here? What are these doing here? Such an important question. And then, of course, many years later, during the 91 Gulf War, when you're watching the war unfolding on your televisions, in your front room, watching Baghdad burning, your mum says, how come there are no Iraqi restaurants in New York? Meaning, why aren't we seen? So, these beautiful objects are seen, and we know them, and the people who made them or their descendants are not visible. So this idea of being visible, the population being visible, but also this idea of storytelling is important. So I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about that, your mother's stories.
Well, I think it's really beautifully put forward in your work, just the importance of transmission, but oftentimes what happens in families is that you become a fearless listener, and fearless listening can enable fearless speaking. And so for my mother to be able to speak these things, and by the way, she wasn't born in Baghdad, she was born in Bombay, actually.
Oh, sorry, it was your grandmother that was born in Baghdad.
Yeah, no, and my uncle, who just passed away, was the last person in our family who was alive, who could still recall life in Baghdad. They left after his bar mitzvah. And so they went to India and then came to the States. And I think that, my mother, I was lucky enough to grow up around my grandmother as well as my mother. And so I heard a lot of those stories from the primary source, of hearing my grandmother recount life in Baghdad, but it was always it was always the mundane memories that seemed so extraordinary to me, about like how thick the palm trees would get, talking about the scorpions that lived in the basement, that they were able to kind of coexist with, talking about these towers, because I was having trouble at a certain point when I was in first grade, I was 6 years old, learning numbers, and I couldn't read a clock. And my grandmother said, well, if we were in Baghdad, you wouldn't need a clock. You would hear these towers sing the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, how's that possible? And she goes, you would hear it 5 times a day. And I'm like, but I'm told that there's 12 different numbers on the clock. And she goes, well, they would sing the songs, and she never explained what they were. And it wasn't until much later I realized that she was talking about the minarets.
Mm-hmm.
And, as Jews living in Baghdad, they were a part, not of necessarily the religious space, but of their public space, that it was an urban condition. And my grandmother died when I was 10. The US invaded Iraq when I was 15. And so I started to realize that like my grandmother's stories were threatened, that these stories, had the potential to disappear. And I think that's what my mother was always pointing to in, these things that she would tell us, without much drama, and that made it, I think I realized in that moment that I was going to be working for a long time to make sure that those stories didn't disappear. And it's one of the things that I absolutely love about this project of yours, is that, it does all of these things that you'll talk about, I'm sure, but like thinking about the parallels, between the early 1900s in Baghdad, the early 1900s in Ireland, the early 1900s, and all those symmetries that start to kind of create points along the same line. And so I think about that a lot. And, it is part of like the joy of having a family as well. For me, is like, I may not be the best speaker of Iraqi, Jewish, Arabic, but, I know how to make a mean dolma, and knowing that that's a certain kind of transmission that I'm downloading onto my kids, and that they're part of like this thing that you're keeping alive. And it may sound trite, to say that that's what we engage in, but, it becomes something that's like a galaxy, holding all of those flavors together, and they become portals into a place that we don't have access to, and a time we don't have access to, but it can still be made present.
I've been really lucky to have eaten twice, I think, when you've cooked for me in a big group of people, and it is a really extraordinary experience, Michael. It's fantastic. And the last one, which was at the Whitechapel, I sat down next to a woman who I spoke to across the table, who turned out to be the sister of Maysoon Pachachi, the filmmaker.
Who's here with us tonight.
Who I know. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
It was just so amazing, to come to your dinner. And, I've never met Maysoon's sister before, but here in this space, there it was perfect. And I was with my sister. But so with what I did with my mother was to I did kind of some training on how to do oral history interviews, and I got her to talk her life, from the beginning, her first memories all the way through to now. So it was many, many hours of recordings, and what's ended up in the film is only the tiniest little snippets. And because she was the child of an exile, an Irishman Irish parents who had moved here in the late 20s, early 30s, her experience of his exile was of utter misery. He was a man who was living in the, at the heart of the colonial occupier. It's like he was never happy living in Britain, and she always hated having that kind of what she described as the exile's misery around her. But I wanted to make that connection, because it was there already in her story, between the Irish War of Independence, and then the Arab revolt in Iraq, the Iraqi revolt, which followed the end of the First World War, actually. And so the British decided they would stay after the end of the First World War, despite having promised the Arabs independence from the Ottomans. And it became very apparent quickly that this was going to happen, and there was a very strong resistance to that. And this resistance was only crushed through the use of air power, which is one of my preoccupations in my work in any case. Oh, I've totally lost my thread of thought there. I wanted to talk about the way she talks about the young men that she met. So when she met my dad, he was here studying as a young man, and she met all his friends. And this was when Iraq was still a monarchy, and there was a big push for independence from the British and overthrowing the monarchy. And the revolution eventually happened in 1958, and that was successful in that sense. But she talked about their enthusiasm and their passion and it made me think, it just made me think of the young Iraqis who were protesting in 2019 in October, all of that optimism that they were experiencing. And I suppose that was something I wanted to talk to you about, Rijin, this this kind of drive for change. I mean, if you think about it, it was 1919 that the Arabs started resisting British occupation, and we were talking about 2019 when these young Arabs were Iraqis were kind of trying to fight for a different future for themselves, and needing to have their voices heard. And again, it's kind of going back to what you were saying earlier about not just supporting them and making their work, but in their work being seen and their voices being heard.
Yeah, I think there's a, even with the protests, I mean, the kind of protests of Iraqis with the different governments that have been installed in Iraq has been very long. Like there's such a long and deep history of that. And so I think this is something that's very much generation to generation of who's there, because throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was also a lot of protest against the government or the regime, but it wasn't visible because this was all done through a very intense sort of apparatus, and so you didn't see the people who were sort of in jails or being tortured, mm-hmm. or all of this kind of violence against those who were protesting in many different ways in the decades before. And the protests that we saw in 2019 also came from earlier protests in the South, especially around Majnoon Field and Basra, in the provinces around there, where first a lot of the oil companies are situated, and there's not a lot of employment for Iraqis to be involved in that kind of work, apart from more elite, politicians and who they employ. Or who their contracts are with, and also with the electricity issue and the issue of drinking water, like in Basra in particular, in these areas where it's, this was never an issue before. And then after the invasion, you see this complete, sort of destruction of infrastructure where there isn't electricity, there isn't clean drinking water, crops are dry, water becomes a really scarce resource. And so the protests also grew from that and then gained sort of traction. And in 2019, we saw the main protests in Baghdad, which made it more visible to everyone because it was in Baghdad and had this like huge swell of young people leading and organizing around it. So, I think this is also, and it's something that's continuing to happen, but in different ways, because, over 1,000 people, young people, were murdered during the protests and have continued to be sort of assassinated since then, organizers, political activists. And the Iraqi Human Rights Observatory is doing a good job of sort of tracking some of that and looking at how protesters are being targeted even after the protests. So just recently, 3 men who were protesting in an electricity plant have been jailed, under these sort of false charges. So there's, I guess I say all that to show that to say that there's this very long and deep history of protests. And I think it comes from this deep engagement in politics and in, you know, political and social life that is so a part of the organizing of Iraq's, like, you know, a very normal part of life where people know their history, they know their politics, they're engaged in an everyday way. Which is, you know, when you speak about your father being, you know, not so happy here, I think this is also a story that is very common, but isn't necessarily talked about. It's this idea that as long as you have a place to go, the story's over and everything's okay. But there's a very different kind of life in the UK and America and Europe where you don't get to keep your life. You know, you don't get to keep this kind of really incredible social community and political community that you have, and you have to sort of, that has to die in a lot of ways. And so I think that story is also a really important one, where the reason there are all these refugees or people who have to immigrate and sort of acclimate to this completely different country and way of living is also a huge loss, and should not have had to happen. You know, so the loss isn't just with accepting asylum seekers, it's with the fact that they had to leave in the first place and sort of leave their language and their home and their family and all of these things behind.
But that's very, but what's interesting about those protests in Baghdad was that they were only very sporadically and temporarily visible. And what's really interesting is the way in which most of what happens in Iraq is invisible. Nobody's interested and nobody's looking. Everybody's looking elsewhere almost all of the time. You know, it has to be something pretty spectacular to make it onto certainly the front pages of the Western press. But that idea of invisibility and visibility, I think, Michael, you've dealt with in your work so beautifully, where you talk about objects, you know, objects from museum collections reappearing, you know, this idea of something that's been lost suddenly appearing, or you actively making it, you know, you're making it reappear. So you describe it in terms of haunting in some of the works that you've made. And I'm very interested in that idea of disappearance, you know, the disappearance of, you know, the body, the disappearance of the population, even if it's the history in the way that Rijin is talking about, these complex histories that are utterly overlooked, and disappeared. You know, so thinking about your project, The Invisible Enemy Shouldn't Exist, which sort of started off with the kind of remaking of the objects from the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which had been looted after 2003. And, you know, this is of course, will be a kind of beyond a lifetime's work to recreate all of these objects. Well, you're not recreating them, you're kind of, they're kind of apparitions of those objects. They're kind of like, we're having visions of them when we see those works. But I wanted to talk a little bit about museum objects in museum collections like the tray, because the tray for me is not so much, it's not an object that's haunting, it's an object that's kind of appeared out of nowhere. It's sort of a time traveling object. I think of some of the objects I'm interested in now are objects that have kind of been in limbo and missing for some period of time, sometimes hundreds of years, sometimes decades, and suddenly they appear in these collections like this tray. So the tray has this strange narrative where somebody donated it to the collection who used to actually work as an attendant in the museum. The date of it isn't even recorded. It's not considered a kind of an object of enough value to have had much attention paid to it. And it's only when, you know, one of the curators came across it by chance that it was acquisitioned properly. And that was in the run up to the 2003 Iraq War, because he noticed that it had these airplanes on it and it appeared to be, you know, British soldiers engaged in a conflict in Iraq in whatever it was, 1918. So, you know, I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about that, Michael, this idea of objects and their value, because I wanted, and also Regina, I wanted to ask you about collections and maybe touching a little bit on the show that you did in Los Angeles, which was a kind of conversation with the Doris Duke collection. But Michael, maybe could you say something about that? This kind of the parallel between the kind of disappeared history and people and something about objects, disappeared objects.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, back to that primal scene of my mother bringing us to the British Museum when we were visiting my uncle there, and more or less telling us that The Lion Hunt of Ashurbanipal was the first comic book in human history, and that it comes from the place where my grandmother, who had just passed away, is from, where my mother is from, and where we're from. And when you're 10 years old, there's nothing cooler than hearing that your people are responsible for the first comic book. And
they're responsible for everything, not just comics.
but it made me realize, like, when my mother then turned to us and said, and what is it doing here, that like these museums were not just these polite reliquaries of the mutual exchange of like the cultures across the world. They were crime palaces. And so I think that I think everyone who makes art probably has the same bittersweet relationship of understanding that the DNA of the museum is separating the objects from the people to whom they belonged. And so when the Iraq War happened in 2003, and the first moment of pathos that opened up in the war could arguably said was like the collective outrage of people seeing the museum looted. It didn't matter if you were for the war or against the war. It seemed like everybody was found this to be tragic. But when that outrage about lost objects didn't turn into an outrage about lost lives, that was when I started to think about these things coming back. And in Mesopotamia, these votive statues that normally will have like their hands clasped in front, this one is missing its top because it was damaged in antiquity. They were supposed to be surrogates for the people who actually went to the Akitu, or the temple, to pray. And the idea was that you would leave this in your stead. And so you were always praying, right? So the blessings would never stop reaching you. And so as I started to think about them as votives for the lost Iraqis, as surrogates for the lost Iraqis, the project took on this extra meaning. And so I was using the word reconstruct early on in the project. But then as like people started to talk about 3D printing and everything else as a kind of almost like a digital version of colonialism and extraction, I started to pivot a bit and realize that like that's not what I wanted to do. And that, it was a reappearance, because I'm making all of these things out of these very vulnerable materials. So it's something that's disappeared that will, that reappears and will one day disappear again. So it keeps, through the kind of materiality, it keeps it alive, the fact that it can never truly be replaced. And so that was the impetus for that. And I think that one of the things that, looking at all these objects that I have in front of me here that I prepared, from the studio, there are all these broken bodies, and so one of the quotes that accompanies these objects from one of the archaeologists says that the damage, if ancient, was probably visited on the object to render it less potent by a marauding army. And so when you see those symmetries in those very things that are in vitrines and museums in the West that are pointing to the things that are happening in Iraq, it's the same thing, again, this beautiful moment in your work where, there's this picture of somebody being hanged, there's an etching of somebody being hanged, and your mother is talking about, the violent suppression of rebellion, and where is it? Is it in Baghdad? Is it in Derry? Like, and that's the thing that you realize, that in all of these objects, the beautiful thing with your work is like how closely you observe and get into it, where it does become a world, it does become a landscape. So those symmetries, for me, I find them very powerful.
Yeah, and Rijin, I was really moved when you invited me to show some of the stills from my film Shadow Sites too in your exhibition, which was titled, it was Shangri-La.
Imagine Cities.
Imagine Cities, that's right. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about the fact that you were showing these contemporary works in relation to this collection of Islamic art, the Doris Duke collection, and also the way that you didn't produce an exhibition catalogue, you know, you produced a really substantial publication that accompanied that show, which I've got here somewhere, which is not, you know, it's not a catalogue in the traditional sense. It's you know, you included, what I'd like you to maybe say a bit about is the way in which, let's say, the museum building that's going on in the Gulf at the moment, even thinking about not even so much the contemporary spaces, but maybe, you know, the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, for example, you know, this idea of sort of replicating, it's not quite the universal museum, but, you know, collecting in that way, and thinking about what you've written about the kind of extraction of cultural material from Iraq too, this kind of sucking out of Iraq that's happened, that it's kind of been emptied out. So, you know, and you touch on here, you have people who've contributing like Walid Ra'ad, who's you know, thought and written about the kind of industry of contemporary art in the Arab world, and you've invited people from the Gulf, from Gulf labor to write about, you know, the exploitation of labor in terms of building these museums. So could you just say a little bit about that?
You know, the exhibition, well, I'll say, you know, echoing Michael a little bit, part of the reason, maybe a huge part of the reason actually is that your work is important to me, is that there is often this abstraction between Iraqi objects from Iraq and the actual place and what it is now, and what it is and what it always has been. And I think what is really important about this video, but also in your previous work, is this like refusal to let that happen, and the insistence on actually having a relationship that continues, you know, throughout the period of what you found and what the history is between, you know, a living history. And so I think that's very critical in your work, and is part of what was important to me about this show, because when I got to LA and started to do some research and, you know, started to dig into the project, it was in relationship to the Doris Duke exhibition, which is a lot of sort of traveling through different places and, you know, rugs and objects and things like that. And this idea that this is Islamic art, and also having and this idea of what does it mean to have a contemporary show of Islamic art. And in some of my conversations with curators or people who had collections, there was an idea that the work we see today is related. And in a lot of ways it isn't, you know, like they're showing me, they've decided to acquire this work because part of it looks like an ancient object that is in an old collection. And there's actually no sort of through line between the work of this person and that, except for some very superficial aesthetics that there's a pattern that might be in there that wasn't necessarily meant to be, but is there. And so it's connected. And so I think that is part of what I wanted to problematize a bit, of having this idea that there is this one monolithic thing, even though a lot of the artists would never describe their work as such. And it's part of this idea of like antiquating the Middle East all the time and pretending that it's still this old place that is so bizarre and other, you know, and strange. And it's very, I mean, to me, it's a very sort of obvious Orientalist approach to work that's happening today. And it also is part of the reason why even very contemporary exhibitions up until very recently were still trying to pretend that there was this lack of art in certain, you know, in Iraq and other parts of the world, and it was only able to be represented by really by abstracted objects, you know, this idea that there's nothing in between, or there's no bridge, or nothing that's being produced today that's of value, which obviously has political undertones. And so I think that this kind of erasure of contemporary history and production was something that I wanted to kind of work against by inviting artists like you, like Charles Gaines, you know, at the time, George Audi, Galareh Koshkozar, and, you know, Hagai Vazian. There were artists who sort of are working today and exploring and mining aspects of these interconnected politics that, you know, kind of defy this kind of categorization. And so I think the publication was needed because it was kind of important to go into more depth around that. And I opened it with Charles Gaines's 94 essay, which was Theater of Refusal, because it is this sort of discussion around African-American exhibition making and the sort of limitations around that at the time, and the way that that work was sort of undervalued or put into very specific political terms, as opposed to being like sort of taken as of similar value as other kinds of artworks. And so there was like, you know, there was an obvious relationship to that that I wanted to kind of bring forth, that this isn't, you know, there's often this idea that this is the first time anything has happened. This is the first exhibition here, the first exhibition there. And so I wanted to bring some history of criticism, especially in relation to different writers, to kind of also work against that there is no first exhibition, because this has always been taking place. And so in terms of Islamic art, you know, the museum in Doha, well, first, when they talk about collections, you know, there has, of course, been this huge migration of work from Iraq to a lot of the places who, you know, funded and enabled the war to happen. So not only in America, but also in the Gulf states. Some of that there was participation in and was sort of above board, and a lot of it is not, as it always is when like work is taken during a time of conflict or active war. And so I think the discussion around the museum building in the Gulf has often left out the fact that much of this came about after the invasion of Iraq, and with the extreme profits that were made through that, and the kind of alliances with the American military that came around the enormous bases in the Gulf, and the sort of way that this enabled a lot of the development of the Gulf states, including their culture scene or their cultural endeavors. And so that's sort of important in the way that Iraqi art has been used in this way. And some of it, again, is people have agreed to cooperate and you know, either send their collections, have them be acquired, or make work. But with the Islamic Museum of Doha, they have an enormous Baghdad exhibition that's taking place during the World Cup. And so this became a problem because of how they were framing Doha as a kind of natural city in line after Baghdad, and in terms of being the next place where people came together, and describing ancient Baghdad as the site that is similar to Silicon Valley, with people coming together to like enable innovation and new technologies to take place. So this is a kind of like, so this is sort of where the problem comes in, was kind of trying to build
appropriating that narrative and history.
Right.
I'm aware that and Emily's joining us again, so that to remind us that we need to close. But I don't want to finish before just saying that although after 4 or 5 years of running Sadat in Baghdad, the situation became so difficult and untenable that you had to pause the program. But I just wanted to say that I know that you're making a film for Documenta, which will be seen in June, and you're working with a number of the students that you'd worked with in Baghdad during that period, and that Michael, amongst others, is mentoring one of the students, well, they're not students anymore, the artists, for this film. And I just wanted to draw attention to that, and maybe, I don't know if there'll be a question about it, but maybe you could just say a little bit about it, both of you, because I really want to hear how that process has gone, even though it's still in progress. So I don't know, maybe Rijin, you could just, I don't know, Emily, can we just have a squeeze another 5 minutes? Maybe
I'll quickly say,
briefly say something about it, the film, and Michael, maybe you could just offer us a couple of your minutes of reflection on your experience of mentoring.
I would say, so the films are, I invited 4 of the artists who were part of SEDA, former students, to make short videos, short films, sort of to offer up a kind of visualization experience, or a means to do that, kind of in line of what we've been talking about, which is this like lack of these like tangible ways to see Iraq and artists, and, you know, actually see something as opposed to objects. And none of them are filmmakers, actually. One of them works in video a bit, but not on a regular basis. So it was an interesting, but I think important challenge to sort of work on this. And I wanted to invite several artist mentors, similarly to what we did before with Sada. And like, I will also add that 2 of the former students are coming just as to see the exhibitions, and which was also a part of Sada, to be able to bring artists into other exhibitions to sort of see and learn from. And Michael has been really generous with his time with one of our students, and I will also say with me, mentoring me with a lot of questions and sort of, problems that I've dealt with or would love advice on and need some guidance on. So I would, with that, I'd want to have Michael be able to talk about his really important role in this.
No, I mean, it's just been an incredible honor. I've not been to Iraq. You both have. I hope, inshallah, there's a time when I can go with all of you. But I always feel like when we're the 3 of us together, that place comes a little closer. And our relations are really important to me, and it's something that I cherish. And so Rijin's invitation, to have me work closely with an artist who lives here named Bassem al-Shakir, who's just wonderful. It's been really meaningful in ways that just, goes beyond language. And that Documenta exhibition is one that's really special to me. I think it's special for many artists because the DNA of that exhibition was asking the question in 1955, 10 years after the end of the war, 90% of the city of Kassel was still in ruins. And so the first artistic director, Arnold Bode, asked, what role could culture have in rebuilding Germany, which itself is a problematic term because it is a nation state, and nation statehood is what kind of fueled so much of the nationalism that made the situation of the rise of the Third Reich and everything else happen. And so it asks questions of art, in terms of like, what is its relationship to this idea or this concept, but like thinking about culture as something that happens everywhere despite it all. And so much of what Rijin has brought, through the information that she's shared with me and for everybody else about Sada and about the artists that she's introduced us to their work, people like Sejad and Ali Ayal, realizing that on the ground, in the midst of something like the October 2019 protests and revolution, and people are making art, as part of the work on the front lines, that it's important in that space. And also some of the artists are making food, for the protesters. And so you realize that like all of these things, the reason we need all of this is very, very, it's very primal in a lot of ways. And it's also, not something that necessarily needs to be separated from life. And so this mentorship, if you're going to call it a mentorship, one of the things I love about being an artist is being in conversation with other artists. And I feel like that's what it's been. And I'm really grateful.
Thanks, Michael. Emily, do we have any questions then, seeing as we've gone over time?
So we do have one, which I think Rijin has kind of answered already, but it's around whether the artists that you're working with, Rijin, will be able to visit the Documenta exhibition in Germany.
Yeah, that's a good question, because that is part of the biggest issue with those who remain in Iraq in terms of getting visas. And it's actually even a question for some of the artists who are living as foreign residents in countries and haven't yet obtained, full status. So one of the things we're hoping with Documenta, because it's such a major event and is funded by the German government, is that they will be able to sort of help get the visas for some of the students. So two of the students are in France. One is doing a residency and one left Baghdad about 5 years ago and has been to France. And so two of the artists, Ra'ad and Sajjad, who are in Baghdad, have applied for their visas and we're waiting. And one of our artists, Sarah Manaf, who's in Turkey, has also applied. So we're waiting on that and hoping that they'll be able to attend. But the idea was that they would have to be able to, the purpose of it was that they would be able to attend, see the space, see their work in the space, and be able to attend Documenta as well as part of the project. And obviously all of the collectives, Documenta is focused on collectives, and so the collectives will be there. And so obviously our desire is that this would be no different.
For those who might not know, could you give the dates for when Documenta will be on in Germany? Maybe if people want to go and visit. Yeah,
the public opening is June 18th, or it opens on June 18th, and it goes for about 3 months.
Okay, so we have another comment, which I guess is more of a comment rather than a question. But it's a Sam saying, thank you, Jananne, Regina, and Michael. Delighted to listen to your thoughts, reflection, and conversation. And 1,000 congratulations to all the great work. And they hope that they manage to see the installation at Towner. Okay, so actually it feels like we've wrapped up in pretty good time, as it's now 7. Jananne, do you want to say anything further before I just say some closing remarks?
No, thank you. I'm just really pleased that we managed to come in on time.
Cool.
Thanks, Michael and Regine. Yeah, sorry, I want to thank you both as well for being here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone, all our brilliant panel for your discussion, and also to Samaya for the BSL interpretation, and also to my colleague Jess, who's been behind the scenes doing our PowerPoint presentation. You'll see that I've just put in the chat some information about one more event that we have that will be on Saturday, 7th of May, in association with Jananne's exhibition. And this one's going to be in person at Towner Eastbourne, looking at some of the themes behind Jananne's exhibitions. And you've also got until the 22nd of May, so under a month now, to see the exhibitions here at Towner. So please do visit if you haven't yet and are able to. So thank you everyone. I hope you have a lovely evening or morning or midday, wherever you are in the world.
Thanks for hosting, Emily. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.